Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over a many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of some one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Edgar Allan Poe was one of the most influential American writers, poets, and critics. His work includes short stories, novels, poetry, essays, and book reviews. He is famous for his tales of horror and poetry such as The Raven, The Telltale Heart, and The Fall of the House of the Usher. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809, to traveling actors and had two other siblings, William Henry Leonard Poe and Rosalie Poe. After 3 years of his birth, both of his parents died. He and his siblings were then separated.
This had a huge effect on his literary works, especially those that had dark and suspenseful effect on readers. It was a dramatic and sudden event in his life.
Poe was taken in by John Allan, a wealthy tobacco merchant, and his wife Frances Valentine Allan, who lived in Richmond, Virginia. While Poe stayed with them for the majority of his childhood, they constantly moved to new houses and new areas. As Poe was becoming older, John Allan would rear him to become a businessman. However, Poe had dreams of becoming a writer and poet. Poe left Richmond to attend the University of Virginia in 1826. Although he excelled in his classes, he accumulated a considerable amount of debt. Once Poe returned to Richmond, he found that his fiancée had become married to another man. On top of that, John Allan grew hostile towards him. Poe then finally stormed out to pursue his dream of becoming a great poet. He published the book Tamerlane when he was 18 years old.
These were the first books of poetry that he published. Poe received very little for them. He later struggled with poverty.
Later on, he published another book of poems known as Alarath, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems. 2 years after he published his first book, he enlisted into the United States Army. After only 8 months in the United States Military Academy, he was expelled. While suffering from extreme poverty, Poe turned to Baltimore and called upon his relative. Poe's aunt Maria Clemm welcomed him into her home and became a new mother to him. His cousin Virginia Clemm acted as a courier to carry letters to Poe's lovers. However, she then became his muse. At the age of 27, Poe married Virginia, who was only 13 years old. Poe had published short stories, one that even won a contest sponsored by the Saturday Visitor. This then led to an editorial position at the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. During his lifetime, Poe had written dozens of poems and short stories, although some have not been published. Many focus on dark and gloomy characters and settings. They have been in print since 1827. In 1842, Poe's wife had contracted tuberculosis and died. After this, Poe spent much of his time from one city to the next, giving lectures and finding backers for his latest proposed magazine project called The Stylus. While on a lecture tour in Lowell, Massachusetts, Poe befriended Nancy Richmond. He fell in love with her, and this inspired some of his greatest poetry. Later on, Poe found his first fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton, who was now a widow, and began to court her again. Before he left Richmond on a trip to Virginia, they were engaged. On the way to Philadelphia, Poe stopped in Baltimore and disappeared for 5 days. He was found in the barroom of a public house. He spent the last days of his life in Washington College Hospital, surrounded by strangers. Neither of Poe's relatives or close friends knew about this until it was published on newspapers. Poe died on October 7, 1849, at the age of 40. The exact cause of Poe's death is a mystery. Poe's literary rival, Rufus Griswold, wrote a false obituary about Poe days after his death in an attempt at revenge for offensive things that Poe has said. Instead of the public dismissing Poe and his work, the sales of Poe's books rose extremely high because of the false biography. Poe is a magnificent writer and poet. He is widely acknowledged as the inventor of modern detective stories and an innovator in science fiction. He is a great American critic. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by my side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre by there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea.